If you're thinking about getting a new PC for editing videos, this is the right place to be. In a minute we'll discuss what's most important for editing tasks and we'll answer a lot of questions you'd probably have down the road. My name is Piotr Toshinsky, you can call me Peter, and this channel is all about mastering film editing, so you can craft stories that resonate with your audience, stories that can eventually make a difference in their lives. Many people getting into video editing asks about building a PC for that purpose. I wanted to have a good answer for them, but to be honest, I'm not good at building PCs. And actually, I didn't even know what's the most important factor for editing tasks and so on. So, I've asked James from logicalincrements.com to help me out. James was so great that he has sent me the article on that topic. But still, I had some questions and he agreed to answer it for you guys. So, after we go through all of the components and how important they are for editing tasks, we'll have James on the show. So let's dig into it. I've learned a lot doing research for this video and I hope you can learn from it as well, and you'll be confident building your next editing machine. Before we go into computer parts and how important they are for editing tasks, I just want to stress one thing. If you're a fresh filmmaker, it's not your job, you're not doing it for a living. Don't think that you need a powerful machine. The truth is, you can do all of the editing you can see in feature films with any machine on any available editing software. So work with what you have, it's really not that important. Any pro will tell you that instead of focusing on tools, you should focus on how to become actually good. And this is done through storytelling, this is done through reading books, screenplays, watching movies, gathering feedback on your work, and so on. And these are things that don't require any expensive tools. But if video production and video editing is the way you make a living, a good PC will speed up things for you. It will make your work more efficient and eventually will save you money. So let's have a look what's the most important factor we should focus on when building a PC for video editing. It's CPU that determines how quickly you can accomplish editing tasks. The exception here is DaVinci Resolve, which depends pretty heavily on GPU computing power. So video editing software uses CPU in two main ways. The first one is encoding and exporting videos, and the second one is generating video previews during the editing process. Also, the software will take advantage of multi-CPU cores and hyperthreading, either you're on Premiere Pro, Sony Vegas, Final Cut Pro, and so on. The article references to the test run by Puget Systems that looked into benefits of multi-core CPUs. As an example, exporting 1080p H.264 video, the test found that Premiere can utilize 10 cores before the performance plateaued. For the complex project timeline, tests showed that 2 cores produced 2 times the performance of 1 core, 5 cores resulted in 4 times the performance, and 10 cores produced 6 times the performance. Trying to utilize 16 or more cores, however, actually caused a noticeable drop in performance to around 5x. So CPU is where you should invest in a major part of your budget, and a 6-core CPU would be a minimum if you're serious about building a powerful editing machine. By the rule of thumb, the higher the resolution of the footage you're working on, the more you will benefit from the faster CPU. The guys from Logical Increments suggest the best option depending on the budget in the article I based this video on. Then we have a GPU graphics card, which is very important if you're playing a lot of games, but for editing video it's actually less important than CPU. But it still affects the performance, especially if you're using effects that rely on GPU, such as lumetri color, blurs, transitions, blend modes, and so on. Once again, the exception here is DaVinci Resolve, which may require a more powerful GPU. But what's worth remembering here is that you don't need the best graphics card on the market, because the advantage you'll get from it is not that big of a difference. Another takeoff is that Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve will do well with both AMD and Nvidia graphics card, although Adobe tends to optimize for Nvidia. RAM is important as well, and generally speaking, video editing software tends to use large amount of RAM very well. So the higher the resolution of the footage, the more RAM will be useful. 16GB should be a starting point, but if you're editing 4K footage, you should consider 32, 64 or even more. But again, this is less important than the good CPU and a decent graphics card. Of course, SSDs provide much better performance than hard drives, so it would be best to work only on SSDs. If you have a footage with a high bitrate and you're playing few clips simultaneously, HDDs can begin to drop frames. So here is the ranking of the storage configurations. Worst case scenario: HDD for everything: operating system, project files, source footage, cache. Much better scenario: SSD for everything: operating system, project files, source footage, cache. Even better scenario: SSD 1 for operating system and software, SSD 2 for project files, source footage, cache. And even better than this: SSD 1 for operating system and software, SSD 2 for project files and source footage, and SSD 3 for cache files. Again, it's not like you actually have to have SSD. If you're not working with highly compressed, high bitrate, high resolution footage, hard drive should be good in most scenarios. But if you can afford it, buy at least small SSD for operating system and software. This should make a big difference. The specs of motherboard itself will not affect the performance when editing videos, but remember that other components needs to be well supported by the motherboard. Also remember that it is good to have onboard sound and number of USB ports. A high quality power supply unit is a must for any video editing PC, and since it's quite difficult to recognize which one is high quality, it's best to get recommendation from trusted sources and websites. And now it's time for the questions I have had for James.
Hey Peter, thanks for inviting me to answer some questions for this video about building a PC for video editing. This is James from Logical Increments and Logical Cameras. We'll jump right into it. So first, I should say that I do all of my editing in Premiere Pro, so all of my advice is kind of based with that background knowledge. That said, this should be pretty universal to any other application you might be using. If I had a system that had one SSD and one hard drive, how would I arrange things? First of all, if the project was small enough, like if I only had like 200 gigabytes of media files that I was working with for a given project, I would edit everything on my one SSD. I would have my OS, my software, all my source files, and my media cache, etc., all on the SSD. If my files are taking up too much space, which is very likely, I would be using my hard drive. And the way I would arrange things is I would have my operating system and my software, like Premiere or the Adobe Creative Suite, on my SSD, and I would have everything else on the hard drive. In an ideal world, you would have your OS and software on one SSD and all the other files on another SSD. Most importantly, you would have your media cache on your second SSD. First of all, you should feel absolutely fine rendering to your SSD. Render to your SSD to your heart's content. It's faster than rendering to your hard drive. I think that this worry about rendering to SSDs was somehow born out of the idea that you can wear your SSD out if you're rendering to it all the time. Thankfully, modern SSDs are way too durable for anyone to be worried about wearing them out with normal use like that. A few years ago, Tech Report did a really awesome endurance test of a bunch of different SSDs, and they found that the SSDs, for the most part, were still going strong after writing 600 terabytes of data to them. Just for a frame of reference, that would be writing 300 gigabytes of data to your SSD every day for 5 years straight. I think the vast majority of us don't use our SSDs to that degree, so you should feel fine writing as much to your SSD as you want. So from a hardware performance perspective, editing VR or 360 video is very similar to editing 2D video, except you're normally working with much higher resolutions. It's a much more intensive task than editing a video in 1080p, for example. Say, because you can have, say, a 12 or a 16 or a 24 camera GoPro rig that you've shot some 360 video on, and then when you go in to edit it, you're working with 12 or 16 or 24 4K clips running simultaneously. So that said, I think that anyone who wants to edit VR or 360 video should have a good CPU, and they should have a good graphics card. I wouldn't go into it just focused on having one or the other be really good and then kind of lacking in the other. Also, make sure you've got plenty of RAM. I haven't personally edited a ton of 360 video, but I wouldn't edit anything with less than 16 gigabytes of RAM, period. I imagine you would want more for editing VR efficiently. So H.265 offers one of two benefits over H.264. You can either have the same video quality at a lower bitrate, meaning a much smaller file size, or you can have superior quality encoding at the same bitrate. This takes longer to export because you're either getting a more compressed file with the same quality, or you're getting a better quality file. In the right situations, I think it's definitely worthwhile to double your export time in order to get either a smaller file or a better file. I can't think of many scenarios where I'd be so pressed for time that waiting a little bit longer for the H.265 file would make a difference to me. There are a lot of different types of RAID. There's RAID 0, RAID 1. So in RAID 0, you take two drives and they appear as one drive combined. So let's say you've got two 1 terabyte drives. They would look like one 2 terabyte drive on your computer. The benefit of this is that your read and write speeds would theoretically be doubled. They're almost doubled in some use cases. You don't really notice it in other use cases. RAID 1, you've got those two same drives. They appear as one 1 terabyte drive because the data is duplicated across the two drives. The benefit of that is if one drive fails, you still have your data on the other drive. RAID 5 kind of combines RAID 0 and RAID 1, but you need 3 hard drives. You have the benefits of having faster speeds with 2 of the drives that are acting like a RAID 0 array, plus an extra drive for some redundancy. Now, if one of these 3 drives fails, the recovery process is a little more difficult. It would take you a few hours, but it's still possible to recover your data. In the old days of DDR3 RAM, it was pretty well known that the difference in overall computer performance, whether you had some relatively slow RAM versus having some really fast RAM, was maybe like 2 to 3% performance improvement overall. Now with DDR4, that difference can be upwards of like 5%. So it's still not a huge difference. And from what we've seen, once you hit like 3200 speed RAM, you're really not seeing a performance improvement in almost any scenario when you get into super high RAM speeds like 4266, for example. I think it's a much better idea to invest that extra money that you would spend to get the fastest RAM and instead upgrade your CPU or your GPU. Get the next thing up from what you were planning to buy. Or just buy more RAM. Buy more RAM at a lower speed and go with the 2133 speed RAM. Obviously, this is going to depend a lot on your budget, but I can tell you what I would look for if I was shopping for a video editing laptop. First priority would be getting the best CPU I can afford. That would mean ideally an i7 or a Xeon processor. Next priority would be my RAM. I would want a laptop with at least 16 gigs of RAM, preferably more, but at least 16 gigs. I would want to make sure I have an SSD instead of a hard drive. I feel like it's pretty common to find laptops with decent SSDs in them these days. I'd try to get the best GPU in that laptop that I could afford. That's it for Peter's questions. Again, my name is James. Please check us out at logicalincrements.com if you are trying to put together a PC for video editing, or check us out at logicalcameras.com if you're shopping for a new camera or lenses. All right, thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks, James. I also have the full version of some of the answers, so if that's something you're interested in, check the card over here. Next time I will show you completely useless trick in Premiere Pro. Yes, you've heard me right. It will be funny, but will not make you better editor in any way. And as a bonus, we'll have the giveaway with the prizes worth more than 300 bucks. Please leave a like if you like the video, and if you want to check out resources I use working as video creator and as video editor, check out the free PDF file I've put together. It was Peter. Until the next time, shoot and edit like there is no tomorrow.